Welcome to Boxworks. For those of you who haven't been here before, this is a co-working space. Tonight I'm going to be a GDPR compliant. It's the thing we're all scared about that's coming soon.
First up, our speaker is Mary Murphy, and co-founder and operations director at FortPrivacy, a data protection operations expert with special interest in privacy by design.
I'm the co-founder in FortPrivacy, and I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about the company because I just want to set the scene for what I'm going to say next. And really, the company is set up. We have we've a diverse team. We've got legal, and we've got 2 barristers and a lawyer on the team, and we also have a number of people who have different experiences and different aspects of running businesses. So we have people with expertise in software. We have myself, my background is in operations. We have somebody whose background is in sales. We have somebody whose background is in risk and compliance. And the reason we have that diversity is because data protection isn't just about the lawyers, and it's not just about the project management, and it's not just about the data protection, the privacy policy. The data that you collect is used right across your company in all aspects of running the company. And therefore, that's what makes GDPR so complex in some ways, but it means that it impacts everybody, and it means that if you really have to get this right, you have to involve everybody as well. So that's kind of to set the scene and to talk about what our company is about. We specialise in data protection. We don't specialise in anything else. We just do data protection. And GDPR we love it. But you can see I have big bags under my eyes at the moment. I still have my pajamas on. I don't quite get dressed these days. It's really busy. It's particularly busy at the moment. There's a lot of people panicking in the last few weeks coming up to May the 25th. And really the message I have for people is that this isn't an easy task, but it's a doable task. But it's also an ongoing task. It's not just you have to get compliant for May the 25th and that's it. Life will go on as normal, revert to pre-GDPR days. This is a change in how we approach managing personal data. It's a shift to having more control and transparency for us as users, as data subjects, when we share our personal data with a business, that we know what's going to happen to it and that we have control over our data. But it's also a shift for businesses in that there's more of a responsibility on businesses to make sure that they have good processes and procedures in place and that they are treating that data with absolute respect. So that's what data protection is doing, and that's what GDPR is doing. And so what I'm going to do, having started off with that lecture, what I'm now going to do is does everybody know what GDPR is? Anybody here who has never heard of GDPR before? Anybody here who would say their knowledge of data protection is absolutely zero, and they're here to get the basics? Or would you feel comfortable? Would you kind of, because what I've prepared in my presentation is that I can go through some of the real basics in terms of the definitions so that it puts into context what I'm going to talk about in terms of what's changing. But I can skim over that very quickly if everybody's fairly comfortable with those definitions. Is everybody? I'll go through them very quickly just to make sure everybody's on the same page, and then we'll get into what does this mean for you guys in your businesses. What do you need to do? So there's a lot of hype about GDPR. There's a lot of big news headlines, almost every day saying, oh my God, the fine. Well, actually, we've stopped talking about the fine so much, which is great. But there's a lot of hype about that, what the impact GDPR is going to have on businesses and what's it going to mean for businesses. And you see headlines like this. Wetherspoon's just deleted its entire marketing database because of GDPR, because of data protection. And probably what happened, and my belief what happened is that Wetherspoon's had a very big data breach. They had 675,000 customer records breached. Now there were email addresses names, marketing information, and age, and I think date of birth in some of the cases. But it wasn't financial information, it wasn't quite serious information. But I bet you that data breach cost them an awful lot of money to contain afterwards. And they probably, as a result of that, saw GDPR coming down the line and sat down and said, actually, what value are we getting out of this marketing database? We're holding an awful lot of personal information here. It's costing us a lot of money to hold that information. They probably were employing a couple of marketing people to manage that information and to feed news stories out to them and to send emails out and to maintain the database. And they probably had invested in software in order to maintain the database as well. And they probably sat down and said, well, actually, how many pints are we selling as a result of all this money that we're putting into the database? How many extra pints are we selling? And really, if you think about it, email marketing isn't a good fit for Wetherspoons. I bet they weren't selling that many pints at all. And they probably said, this database is costing us $250,000 a year to maintain, and it's bringing in 40,000 in extra pints. There's no return on investment. We'd be far better off to run competitions in our pubs on a Tuesday night, or invest in something else. And that, to me, is kind of at the essence of what GDPR will do for businesses. I think it's going to be, some of it is going to be quite good for businesses. There's a discipline that's going to come in of looking at, instead of saying, let's do this because we can do it, that there'll be a little bit of discipline in terms of, let's look at the value that this data is bringing to our business, and then let's look at the responsibility that the data is also bringing to the business, and the costs incurred with meeting those responsibilities, and then let's look and see whether there is that return on cost in terms of the value that's being brought to the business. And that's exactly what Wetherspoons would have done. So they said they were reviewing all the data they hold, and they're looking to minimization of data is a question, something that comes up in GDPR a lot. We felt on balance, so they definitely were looking at the balance, that we didn't want to carry the level of risk. So they're really balancing out the benefit that's coming into the business versus the risk that the business is carrying. And that really is at the essence of working in data protection, that balance between minimizing risk and maximizing benefit and maximizing value to the business. So I'm just going to go through a few slides just with some basics in terms of what is personal data. And this is something that actually I see people misunderstanding the really core thing. What is personal data? Personal data is anything, any data about us. So that is data like your name and your address and the obvious stuff, your telephone number, your age, your date of birth, your PPS number, your bank account number. That's all the obvious stuff, but it's also data about us that's not so obvious. So if you go into an interview and somebody writes on an interview note, writes interview notes about your performance at the interview, that's your personal data. So it's opinions that are expressed about you. It's something that, if you go onto an online, if you go to a webinar and they collect information during the webinar about your interaction with the webinar, and you submit questions and your questions are answered, all of that is potentially your personal data. So your interaction with things are your personal data. So personal data is very broad, and it really is, the assumption should be that if it's about you, it is your personal data, rather than it might not be your personal data. Everything that you do is your personal data. So then there's a second definition, which is special categories of personal data. And that's data that is more sensitive than just what you'd call ordinary personal data. So special categories of personal data is information about your race, your religious or philosophical beliefs, your religion, your political opinions, trade union membership, genetic and biometric data, which is new in GDPR. And the reason it's new is that in 1995, when the existing directive was written, biometric data and genetic data pretty much wasn't processed. Or if it was, I think at the time they were mapping the human genome and it was taking 4 years and it was being done in a research facility and it really wasn't available to everybody. Whereas now you can send off a sample of your hair and that sample of your hair can get your test results, which are genetic markers, back within the space of a couple of weeks. So that data wasn't processed up until very recently. And then health information and then information about your sex life would be all special categories of personal data. So if you're processing personal data, you must have a legal basis to process the personal data, and I'll talk about it as we go through. And if you're processing sensitive or special categories of personal data, you have to have additional safeguards around that processing. Okay, and then a data subject is an easy one. That's us, you and me. We're all data subjects. It's our personal data. So it's you and me when we're identified by I am Mary Murphy, or it's you and me when we're identified by the person who bought the Android phone 2 days ago and turned on location services, and they then were tracked and they spent the evening or the nights at this location and the days at this location. So it's the person who works here and lives here. So you don't know my name, but you know I'm the person who follows that pattern of behaviour. So I am identifiable by that pattern of behaviour. So I don't need to know your name to be handling personal data belonging to you. I just need to have something that may identify you. So that's the data subject. A data controller is a business who determines the purpose and means of processing. And the test for the data controller is if the data controller didn't exist, then the processing wouldn't happen. So a data controller, for instance, if there were schools would be data controllers for your kids' personal data, and if the school didn't exist, your kids' personal data wouldn't be processed as a result of them going to school, because they're going to nowhere, basically. And then the other one is a data processor, and a data processor would process data on behalf of a data controller. So, and that is usually a contractual relationship it should be a contractual relationship between the data controller and the data processor. So they're receiving written instructions from the data controller in order to process that data. So that would be the data controller and the data processors. That's a kind of a flying visit through all the definitions, just to make sure everybody has them all. And then, oh yes, that's the last definition, is processing. And processing is actually anything that's done to data. So from the moment you collect the data until the moment you delete the data, anything that you do with that personal data is processing that data. So, the obvious stuff like collecting the data and viewing it and printing it out and maybe emailing it to somebody and storing it is processing the data. And sometimes people kind of think because they don't physically have access to the data, so they might log in from outside the company and they might view a report or something, that they're not actually processing the data. But once you do anything with the data, you're processing the data. So it's the obvious and the not obvious things. So literally you do anything. And you can do things like archive the data. So you can put it beyond use, but you're still storing it, so you're still processing it. So you've de-risked what you're doing with the data, but you're still responsible under data protection law for that data. So even though you're not actively using the data, if you still hold on to it. So that's where I see a lot of companies falling down. They hold on to data for far too long. And I think it's natural because we're all hoarders, and that we all kind of hold on to stuff in case it might be useful later on. But actually you're carrying an awful lot of risk in case something might be useful later on. So that's data processing, anything that's done to data. So then we come to, I'm actually, because I keep looking back and it's really bad, I'm going to just have a look here so I can see the slides from here that I'm talking about. These are the principles of data protection. And I'm going to skim through these very quickly as well. So under GDPR, there's 7 principles of data protection. Just quickly go through them. The transparency is the first principle. It is that data should be processed fairly, lawfully, and in a transparent manner. And The transparent manner is really important. That is, if you're doing something, if you collect my data and you're doing something with my data, you need to tell me. So I know an awful lot of companies struggling with how to make sure that they tell people what they're doing with data now, and making sure that they're very clear about the processing. And also, if you tell me that this is what you're doing with my data, you need to make sure at the back end that that's consistent with what you're actually doing. So that's the transparent manner. And I'll just talk through the lawfully as well. So this is Article 6 of the GDPR. You have 6 legal bases that you can choose from in order to process data. And you must meet one of those legal bases. And biggest kind of the biggest misunderstanding that I see people processing data, particularly when you're talking about marketing data or social media data and stuff like that, is people think that if data is publicly available, you can process it. But actually, even publicly available data, you have to have a legal basis to process that data. And the legal basis that are open to you are consent, contractual, under a contract, a regulatory requirement. What did I just do? I lost that slide. Sorry. A regulatory requirement. A vital interest of the data subject generally wouldn't be something that would be used by a company for processing data. In the public interest or the exercise of official authority, again, generally that would be politicians and public bodies who would use that process for processing data in general. And then the legitimate interest of the data controller is the final one. So you have the data protection law doesn't have any preference over which one of those is better than the others. But in practice, if you're running a company, you would go for something like a regulatory requirement first, because there's a very clear legal definition of what must be done with the data, and you have very clear instructions about what must be done with the data. So in terms of risk and in terms of the responsibility of managing the data and making decisions about the data, that's really taken out of your hands, and you have a very clear set of duties around handling that data. The second most robust, or the second easiest, from a company's perspective to process, is if you have a contract in place with the person, because again, the contract will lay out what you can and cannot do with that data. The next most robust is legitimate interest, and this is in my order of preference, I have to say. So legitimate interest, but with legitimate interest, you have to be very clear about defining what the legitimate interest is, and doing what's called a legitimate interest assessment. And the legitimate interest assessment is making sure that you test your processing is consistent, and that you have a legitimate interest, first of all, because you may think you have one, and that it is clear and it's proportionate and it's balanced. So you just can't turn up and say, I have a legitimate interest to process data. You have to test that and you have to document it. And then the final one is consent. And consent, the reason I say consent, I put consent at the bottom of my list, is because if you're processing based on consent, consent can be withdrawn at any time. And so you have to have processes in place to handle collecting consent and recording consent, and recording what the person consented to, and then managing the withdrawal of consent. So there's a lot of management around consent. So they're my order of preference in terms of, but the data protection law doesn't say one is better than the other, but I certainly would say one is better than the other, because one is easier to manage than the other. So purpose limitation, when you collect personal data, you need to know what you're collecting it for and what you're going to do with it. So again, the days of saying, oh, well, look, we'll collect this because we might as well collect all these other bits of information because they might come in useful in the future. That's not a GDPR friendly approach to handling personal data. When you're collecting personal data, you need to know what you're going to do with it, and you need to be very specific about what you're going to do with it, and you need to know that in order to be able to be transparent with the data subject and explain to them what you're going to do with it. Okay, data minimization. The data you collect should be limited to the purpose for which you're processing. So my favourite example of this is there's a hotel in Dublin I stay in, and they have on the registration form, they have a marketing sign up, and they ask for your name and your date of birth. And I know why they're asking me for my date of birth. They're asking me for my date of birth because they have over 50s offers that they probably want to send to me. But actually they should, if they really want to know, to give me age appropriate offers, they probably should ask me what age I am rather than what my date of birth is. And it's just the principle of data minimization is really the least amount of information you need for your purposes. And really, do they need to even know my age? They probably feel they do, and maybe I can optionally give that to them or not. But I've never signed up to their marketing list because I just go, ooh, it's a bit creepy. So that's data minimization. Accuracy, once you collect data, it has to be kept up to date. So you should be, the best way to keep data up to date is to give people the ability to update their information. So for instance, just in the recruitment space, for instance, if you have the ability for people to upload their CVs, that you just give them access to upload a new version of their CV at any time, and they have full control over what version of their CV is active or in your system at any particular time, so that you give them the ability to keep the information up to date. Most businesses would have a lot of processes around making sure that data is accurate. And in the banking world, I'm sure Jennifer will tell you that there's an awful lot of, it's very important that data is kept accurate in the banking world. But if you move address, how does the bank know that you've moved address? And how do they have systems in place for detecting that, for asking you whether you have moved or whether any of your information has changed, which they do have, of course. Storage limitation, this is the one, we're hoarders and we keep data for far too long, and data protection law says you shouldn't. And I also say that when you keep data for too long, you're carrying a lot of cost and risk in your business, and particularly if you're dealing with special categories of data, or you have data that might be more sensitive, like financial data, financial information, that kind of stuff, that you you should be looking at retention periods, and you should be clearing out data. And this used to be a problem. When I was little, this wasn't a problem because all data was on paper, and when your filing system got full, you either had to look at your filing system and you had to say, do we pull out all this and clean it out, or do we build another room? And now you can just say, well, I'll just pay Google another $5 and get another 100 gigs or 100 or a terabyte of data, a month, and I can collect as much data as I like. So the limitations that used to be there that forced us to be good about retention aren't there anymore, and so that is an increasing problem as data is online and it's we're dealing with electronic data. So integrity. The final one is the security of the data. So if you collect the data, there is a responsibility on you to keep it secure. And then this is the new bit in GDPR. So this is the accountability principle. So the other principles they exist in the current legislation. They've just been kind of reorganized a little bit. But this is a new principle. And the principle is that if a company is processing personal data, it has to demonstrate that it's capable of processing personal data. And this is the thing that is really exercising businesses now, because you have to be able to demonstrate this accountability. You have to be able to show that your staff have been trained. You have to be able to show that you have policies and procedures. You have to be able to show that you can keep the data secure and that you have measures in place to keep the data secure. You have to be able to show that you are complying with data protection law. And this is the bit of the GDPR that really is, the fines are causing everybody to talk about it. This is the bit that's causing everybody to sit up and take note. So that's the 7 principles. And going back to, the fundamental thing really is that you have to have a legal basis to process the data in the first place. And then you meet all the 7 principles, and then you demonstrate that you're capable of processing the data. So it's a lot of responsibility there in terms of processing that data. So the 2 big shifts when we look at GDPR at a very high level, there are 2 really big shifts in GDPR. And one is that it is, there's a real focus in GDPR on control and transparency for the data subject. And I guess, you know, I always hate in big crowds making people put up their hands and stuff, but, you know, does anybody here feel that they have lost control over their data? You know, have you shared your data and you kind of going, I don't know, you know, where my data is at this stage. It's like it's gone into the ether, and I don't know. I'm actually, at the moment, what's happening to me is that I'm getting a lot of updated privacy notices from a lot of companies. Yeah, everybody's getting that. And I'm going, when did I give them my data? How am I on their database? I've never done any business with them. You know, so, and the other thing I was doing recently was I was doing a little bit of a clear out of cookies on my computer, and there was a cookie from Walmart on my computer. I have never in my life visited a Walmart website. And somebody said to me, oh, you might have been in Morrison's, you know, or not Morrison's, but one of the UK Sainsbury's or Asda, yeah, are owned by Walmart. And I was going, no, I've never visited them either, you know. So I have no idea how that cookie got onto my laptop, you know. So I think there's that need for transparency. I think we can all understand that as data subjects, that there is a lot of companies out there who have collected our data, and you know, now we're starting to see, and they're the ones who are GDPR, you know, trying to be GDPR compliant and sending us the updated privacy notices. You can bet there's an awful lot more out there that haven't, you know, this has gone over their heads at the moment, and they're not sending us those notices. So that control and transparency for the data subject is a big theme through GDPR. There's about 10 clauses of the GDPR that are all about the rights of the data subject. And if you're processing data belonging to, you know, personal data of individuals, you need to know what those rights are, and you need to be able to meet the rights of the individual if you're asked to. And the most common ones would be being able to tell them what's happening with the data, so giving them information about what you're doing with their data, and being able to give them back their data if they ask for it, so a subject access request, if they ask for it, and then if they tell you that their data is out of date, being able to update it. So they would be the most common ones, and then there are other more technical kind of ones that people can exercise those rights if they need to, but most businesses, there are the three that most businesses would have to sit up and take note of and worry about. So the other thing then is to demonstrate compliance for the organisation is a really big thing, and it's what's making us sit up and take note of the GDPR. Once all the headlines about the fines got us to find out what it was, this is the bit that's making us take note. So I'm going to just run through. I hate having really busy slides like this, but it's worth talking about. These are at the next level down, so that's the high level shifts of GDPR, and now this is kind of the detail of at the next level down, what actually is changing. So consent is a really big change. So, by the way, there's a few people taking photos of the slides, and I think we'll make them available afterwards, so if you know, there's no problem, you can have them. So consent, the big change in consent really is that it's no longer okay to assume consent. You have to ask for it. And you know, so this idea of, you know, somebody has interacted with our services, so we're going to assume that they've consented to be on our marketing list, and we'll keep marketing to them until they tell us that they want to opt out. That's no good anymore. So it has to be a clear affirmative action. I consent to, and it needs to be very specific and very informed. What are you consenting to? I'm consenting to receiving information about your products and services. I'm consenting to signing up to your newsletter. I'm consenting to receiving e-receipts from you. I'm consenting to, whatever you're consenting to, it needs to be very clear, very unambiguous. No pre-ticked boxes and no opt-outs anymore. So that's a big challenge for a lot of companies, because if you have a current marketing data, how many people here are worried about their marketing databases? Yeah, okay, so there's bad news and good news. There's the news is if you have a marketing database currently and you can prove that the marketing database that you obtained consent that is compliant with, in line with what the GDPR says for consent, you can continue to use it. And if you don't, you can't. And it's really is kind of black and white. You have to look at your marketing database. You have to look at how do these people sign up. You have to look at, what did I tell them when they signed up? Am I processing the data consistently with what I told them when they signed up? And it's very common for companies to have a marketing database where they had somebody sign up to a newsletter and now they're sending them information about a lot of other different things that are not, So looking at what specifically people signed up to and making sure that you've cleaned up that marketing database, I think is going to be really important. Not really important, necessary. and you don't have you tried to do a cleanup already? No. You don't have much time left. It's easier just to delete. Yeah, in some cases it is. And in some cases, I'm going into companies and they're saying, oh gosh, I'm not sure what we get out of this as well. And, it might be easier to delete, and it might be easier to start from scratch, and it might be easier just to take a look at it and say, well, really, what value are we getting out of it? And do we do something different, in the future? Do we change maybe our marketing tactics? That's easier said than done, of course. I can stand up here and make it sound very easy, but it's a tough decision to make. It really is. Yeah. Okay. So, processors at the moment under the current legislation, if you are a data controller and you outsource your data processing to somebody and they screw up, the buck stops with you, because you should have checked that they were able to process that data when you were outsourcing it. And that's caused, I don't know if you remember SuperValue, and SuperValue had a huge data breach. Their data processors, Loyalty Build, a couple of years back, lost, had a breach of all their credit card data, all the people who'd ever booked hotel and breaks with them. And SuperValue kind of went to say, oh, Loyalty Build, you have to sort this out. And the Data Protection Commissioner said, no, actually, SuperValue, you have to sort this out. Because you chose to work with Loyalty Build, it's your responsibility. You're the ones who are the data controllers. But now, and that's not going to change very much, you still have a responsibility as data controllers to make sure that processors are capable of complying with data protection legislation, but the data protection legislation is also checking that as well. So it's bringing processors into the net. The one-stop shop really is, how many of you work across multiple European countries? A few of you, yeah, okay. So for the multinationals, the one-stop shop really is about allowing us as data subjects to access our data, our rights as data subjects within our own country. So within our country of residence or in the country that we work in, we can access our data subject rights. Whereas prior to GDPR, if I wanted to make a complaint about a company that was based in Belgium, I would have had to go to the Belgian Data Protection Commissioner. And so with multinationals as a data subject, it was difficult because I'd have to figure out where's that multinational based in order to be able to make that complaint. For multinationals, what it means is that you have to choose a base of operations within Europe and say this is where we operate. And it's not like you have a kind of carte blanche choice. You have to examine you have to examine your operations and figure out where your actual base of operations is, and then you deal with the data with the Data Protection Commissioner in that particular country. Breach management. This is a big one. If you have a data breach, you are required to report it, and you're required to report it within 72 hours. So if you're a controller and you've outsourced to a processor, it's really important that your processor is going to tell you about it so that you can meet your requirement of 72 hours. So if you're a data processor, that means you don't have 72 hours. You've got a lot less time in most cases, maybe 24 hours to notify the controller of the data breach, so the controller can assess it and in turn notify of a data breach. So if you've got a very complex data processing chain, that could be going sub-processor to processor to processor to controller, that could, you're getting less and less time at each piece of the chain. So that breach notification within 72 hours also sounds like, that's great, great, we have 72 hours to think about this. 72 hours is a really short space of time when you've had a data breach and you have to pull people into a room and you have to figure out what's gone wrong, and who's been affected and how serious is it and how do we notify people and what, you know, and all of the other stuff that happens when you have a data breach. It's not a very long period of time at all. So the sanctions are what hit the headlines. They're there because they have to be there, because that's something that's changing. But when I look at companies who've had serious data breaches, in every case that I've looked at, the reputational damage has been worse than the sanctions. And the reputational damage, currently the reputational damage is worse than the sanctions that they get, but the reputational damage is worse than the potential sanctions under GDPR. If you look at Facebook, and they lost 100 billion off their share prices in the space of a couple of days, can you ever imagine a regulatory authority in Europe saying, you know, slapping 100 billion fine on a company? It just would never happen. Politically, it would never happen. When I look at TalkTalk in the UK, they had a data breach of about 220,000 data subject records. And they had a pretty big fine. It was £400,000 fine. So, you know, it hit the headlines and it probably hurt them a little bit. But when you look at their revenue loss, their total estimated revenue loss as a direct result of that data breach, because they churned something like, I think they churned about 250,000 customers after that data breach. And as a direct result of the data breach. And I've seen estimates, my very conservative estimate is that they lost at least 50 million as a direct result of that data breach and that customer churn, just the customer churn. But I've seen other estimates that say they lost more like 200 million. So that's way, way higher than any fines. So Cambridge Analytica this morning, it's gone into liquidation. You know, so that's because their customers just went by in the space of a couple of weeks. They just lost all their customers. So, you know, companies just sometimes never recover from a data breach, you know. So that's the sanctions. The data protection officer is required in certain circumstances, but not all circumstances. And really there's a test for it, and you determine how much data you're processing and how much, you know, what type of data you're processing, the nature of your processing on that data, and you can do a test for whether you need to have a data protection officer or not. Privacy by design. Personally, I love this because I'm an engineer, and I really like the idea of being proactive about data protection and designing it in, thinking about it from the beginning. And when I do a lot of work on privacy by design, and my whole philosophy on this is a little and often, little and often. So you think about this, you know, you ask questions at loads of times at different stages through the projects, but you don't completely, you know, stop your project. You just, you know, embed this in, ask the few questions, ask them at the right time, ask the right questions at the right time, and make this part of what you do. And then that's your privacy by design approach. I'm making that sound very simple. It's not quite that simple, but it is really, the philosophy is, do this all the time. Don't overburden yourself. Don't make it something that you have to step out of your business once a year for 3 weeks in order to do it. Make it part of the business, make it part of what you do every day. Think about it, and then just make it become second nature for you. You know, think about this stuff all the time. And then the extraterritorial effect doesn't affect any of you because you're all in Europe anyway, but that is bringing companies outside of Europe, if they're processing data belonging to EU citizens, they come into the net for GDPR as well. So I talked about most of these things as we're going through. So consent, freely given. Data processors come into the net. Some organisations will have to have a data protection officer, and if you're on a borderline on those, you should just do a test and see if you need one. Privacy by design, the 72 hours, the fines. I went through all of this. This is the key thing then. What does this mean for you? How can you do this? Am I going on for too long? Are people getting bored, or are you getting something out of this? You're okay? Yeah, all right. So, because this is the crunch bit. So what does this mean for us? So the GDPR action plan, really if you're a small company, so small to medium enterprise, or a large company, it's pretty much the same steps that you have to take. The good news for the small company is that it'll take a lot less time, and for the large company it'll be a very complex project. But it's pretty much the same things that you have to think about, and it's pretty much the same steps you have to take. With the difference being that the large company may have to appoint a data protection officer and would have to consider that, and the larger company would have more, would probably have more security, more risk that they're carrying in terms of volume of data, and so therefore more security considerations, and so the scale of what you're doing is different, but really it's the same steps. So the first thing, the fundamental thing, and it might seem like a really simple thing to say, know what data you process, but you really wouldn't believe the number of companies who actually don't know what data they process. And not just, and I mean, I see this on a weekly basis. I go in and we look at companies, and they'll say, oh, we found boxes of stuff. We realized, we've been paying a storage company, and when we went down to the storage facility, we discovered that we had boxes of old employee records come back for the last 20 years. So it's not even to that effect of knowing what data, people discovering these things, but actually you need to know some key things about the data that you're processing. So you need to know what you're processing, what you're collecting from people, what you're going to do with it, and why you're collecting it, what processing you're going to do with it. And you also need to know your legal basis for processing. And that's kind of the fundamentals of knowing what data you process. And knowing the legal basis for processing, I can't emphasize this too much. That is really an important question, because that tells you what your obligations around the processing are. So are you processing based on consent? Then you have to have all of those structures in place to manage consent. Are you processing based on legitimate interest? Then you have to test for that legitimate interest, and you have to make sure that you don't process outside of those legitimate interests as well. You don't do more than the legitimate interest would justify doing. Are you processing under regulation? Then you need to understand the regulation. That's usually the easiest part for companies, is if they're processing, if there's a regulatory requirement, because it's very clear, it's very crystal clear. I'm in Waterford, and I have to. So that, I could spend the whole evening on this slide. This is so fundamental. Just sit down and document what you have and document what you process. And companies are almost invariably, there's a surprise somewhere, along the way that I didn't know we were doing that. It happens all the time. So that's the first step. The second step is to develop a record retention policy. So once you know what you have, then you have to figure out how long am I keeping it for. And if you've answered the questions on the first step right, you'll be able to figure out how to justify and how to figure out what the record retention should be, how long you should keep it for. And again, if you have a regulatory requirement, usually the regulations say you must keep these records for X number of years after you finish processing. Revenue records have to be kept for 6 years. It's clear. It's in the retention. If you're processing based on a legitimate basis, if you're processing based on consent, you keep them until consent is withdrawn, and then you get rid of them. If you have a legitimate basis, you figure out what's reasonable, and part of your balancing test would be how long should I be keeping this based on the legitimate basis that I'm processing. So that's the second one, have your retention policy. Review your privacy policy and your privacy statement. So your privacy policy, a privacy statement is an outward-facing statement. It's the statement to your customers, to the people that you collect data from, and it says, what are we doing with your data? What am I collecting this data for? Who am I sharing it with? What am I doing with it? And there's Article 13 and 14 of the GDPR outline what you need to tell people in your privacy statement. So there's a checklist in there that will tell you what kind of information you need to provide in the privacy statement. Your privacy policy is your internal telling your staff what they need to do when they're processing personal data in your organization. It's like your security policy. It's instructions for your staff in terms of what is our policy. Our policy is that we don't transfer data outside of the EEA. Then your staff know that if they're selecting a processor, that they look to make sure that that data is stored in the EEA. So that's what your policy is for. It's for guidance for your staff, to let them know what they should and shouldn't do, and to help them make decisions, and good decisions, about processing the data. Okay, so they're two really important documents. And then be prepared to tell your service users exactly what data you have, and exactly how you're processing it. And again, that's your Article 13, and you just have be prepared to tell them all of that. And when I deliberately use this word, be prepared to tell them, because you'll have your privacy statement, and that information will be in the privacy statement. But if somebody's walking up to you at a counter, at a service desk, and you're collecting information from them, are your staff able to tell people, if somebody says, why do you want that piece of information? Can your staff turn around and say, oh, we need that for X, Y, and Z purpose? So that's where training your staff and making sure that everybody understands what data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and what you do with it is really important. So that's be prepared. And then the last one is, well, I don't think that's quite the last one, I have another one. Be prepared for subject access requests. And that is, if you're collecting and if you're holding personal data on somebody, and anybody, that person can come into you at any time and say, I'd like my data, and you have to give it to them. And so that can be a very complex exercise, and depending on how much data you process on people, it can be, and where the data has gone, and it can be a pretty complex exercise. So you do need to look at whether whether you're prepared to be able to hand that data back to people. And I always say that you should run a dummy exercise. So pick a typical customer and run a dummy exercise and make sure that you can do it, because you only have 30 days to do this. And 30 days sounds like a lot of time, but when you're in the thick of this and you've got, and this is also another place where your retention policies come in handy, because if you've got 14 years worth of emails that you have to go back through, this is going to be a really difficult exercise. Whereas if you've got a retention policy and you're only looking back through 1 year of your emails, it's going to be a much easier exercise. So all these things kind of help each other out as well. So that's the subject access requests. And then look at your high risk areas. So just look at the processing that you're doing, and look at, most companies, it really does depend on the industry. I was going to make a sweeping statement that most companies don't really process high risk data, but they do. They surprisingly would have could have high risk data, even in very, very small companies. I work with a company. There's 7 people in the company, and they process an awful lot of political opinions, and so they have a lot of very high risk data in their company. So it can be a very small company can be processing very high risk data. A very large company can be, large manufacturing companies probably don't process very much high risk data at all, because it's all about the manufacturing process rather than about the people. It doesn't really depend on the size of the company. So if you're processing high-risk data, so high-risk data would be if you're processing special categories of personal data. Actually, there's a lot of definitions of high-risk data. If you think you might be processing high-risk data, there's a Working Party 29, and you can take notes there, a Working Party 29 article on carrying out data protection impact assessments, and that identifies high-risk processing. And then high-risk data would be, any kind of sensitive type of data. So data that would be special categories of data. Location data is considered high risk. Location data like people's GPS location data, biometrics, genetics, health information, well, they're all in the special categories anyway. And financial data would be considered high risk, because the risk to the data subject if you lose that data is very high. What can happen as a consequence of a security breach of that data is very high, and that's where it comes out as being high risk. So look at your high risk areas. So that's kind of the end of the GDPR bit. That was a whistle-stop tour. I think we're taking questions afterwards, but I just, I just have one slide, and that is that there's another piece of legislation coming down the track at us in the next year or two, and everybody's so focused on GDPR at the moment. But there is a e-privacy regulation. E-privacy is the privacy of electronic communications. So, and most of us communicate with our customers via electronic means at the moment. Very little through postal processing and stuff like that. And faxes are a thing of the past. So, well, anyway, fax is electronic communications, what I was saying. So the e-privacy rules are changing in the next couple of years. We're not sure exactly when. It was expected to change with GDPR, but they're going to have another set of implications coming down the road. And I'm not going to throw that at you now, what those implications are, but it's just to be aware that when we get over the hump of GDPR, there's something else coming down. And companies that might look at, it might make sense for a lot of companies, particularly for marketing communications and stuff like that, to look at both of those in tandem and see what you need to do. So I think we'll do questions and answers afterwards, but thank you very much. I hope that was useful.
Thank you.